He's authored and co-authored many books, articles, and papers. He's perhaps best known for the book Capital in Disequilibrium, The Role of Capital in a Changing World, for which he was the recipient of the 1999 Smith Prize for the best book published on Austrian economics. Other works include Austrian Capital Theory, Why It Matters, Recycling Credited Ideas, An Austrian Theory of the Firm, and recently the Subprime Crisis, which will be the basis of his talk tonight. We do have some time at the end for questions. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Peter Lewin.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. Can you hear me okay? Echoing? Echoing okay, and it's echoing a bit in my ears. I'm very pleased to be here. This is a first for me. I have been teaching for about 40 years, the whole of my adult life, and I've encountered many audiences. Not once have I spoken to a political gathering, but I realized John, whatever it is that he's been that I actually will spiel every day I enter. I am by a classic this country and both my direction. So I'm really pleased to thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the committee, and I feel like I'm among friends. I didn't prepare anything too formal. I just want to give you a few remarks about some aspects of economics, particularly about economic policy and history, rather than focusing primarily on the subprime crisis. I'll use that as an illustrative case. I'd like to take a broader perspective and sort of go back and sort of end with that. And I suspect that there may be questions about it if we go to during the Q&A period. So this is my plan. The title that I chose was Boom Bust. Why don't we learn from history? It's something that sort of has been bothering me for a long time. Some of these things, I mean, kind of, by all accounts, somebody who's been interested in economics since the age of 14 is a little weird. And I've known my whole life that I'm a little weird, but it's been sort of more pointed to me, more in my mind recently, that I find myself lying awake at night by what I see happening to this. You may have that I am an American by choice. I mean, I say that not frivolously. It's a nice sounding phrase, but the truth is, I think it is, I learned from my students, many of whom are foreign students and many of whom are not, who have grown up here in America, and I learned from them how easy it is to take for granted what it is that the American civilization signifies and has signified over the last 300 years. I grew up, as you heard, in apartheid South Africa. I know what it's like to live in a police state. I know what freedom in its absence means. I've seen the violence of a totalitarian regime, and I know what people are looking for when they come to the United States as the oldest living republic, that the oldest system that is, existing in history, basically, that has ever attempted anything like this. And when I came to America in September 1972, it was in the midst of a recession. And I remember thinking to myself, I was going, as I will tell you in a little more detail in a moment, when I went to the University of Chicago, I remember thinking that people were telling me that this is a recession. It was the time of the formation of the OPEC oil cartel and the oil prices, the increase in prices, and the price controls that President Nixon put on, and the recession. And I remember thinking to myself, well, if this is how America has recession, I wonder how good it can possibly be in the boom. And I remember thinking that this is an amazing society, that no matter how bad it is, you have the basic faith and the basic commitment that you just have to know that they're going to get through it and they're going to get over it. And I believe that I've been living in America, except recently I have to admit that I had that nagging doubts have begun to creep in. In this current administration and the one that preceded it, and in the many things that have been happening recently, I find myself very, very concerned. I find the current situation very sobering indeed when I look at the forecasts of the economics and so on. So that's sort of how I come to my passion, which is teaching economics and really sort of putting it together with the current situation in an analysis of what we may call political economy. So my plan is to explain how we repeat the mistakes of history, repeating them this time may be particularly serious. And I will start with my answer to that question, which comes in 3 parts. And then I will tell you what aspects of history I think we are repeating. In particular, what kinds of bad now recycling is the title of one of my articles, which will really involve my telling you a little bit about my own odyssey of how I came from South Africa to America and lived here through the last 30 or so years, which brings us up to the current period and the current economic crisis. And then I will stop with there with the conclusion. We can take questions. So why don't we learn from history? I think the answer, as I say, comes in 3 parts. We don't learn from history because history doesn't give us unambiguous answers. History is a social science, it's not a natural science. There is a tendency to think that we can get completely unambiguous hard knowledge from the natural sciences. It is a gross exaggeration. I mean, we have learned an enormous amount from science, but there is still more that we don't know than that we do know, and there is still much that is in dispute. So we tend to exaggerate and elevate, we tend to exaggerate the knowledge of scientists and elevate their authority. Nevertheless, the kinds of answers that we can get from the natural sciences are of a different order than the kinds of knowledge that we can get from the social sciences. History is necessarily dependent upon the interpretation of events that occur in a social context. We're not interpreting events that occur in the natural world. So we're dealing with human intentions, we're dealing with human values, and so on. We could put it in a nutshell, history speaks to us not in one voice, but in many voices. So that we have to, there's no escape from that. Any historical situation is probably consistent with a multiplicity of different stories. Now, it is probably also true that certain historical developments, as I shall try and explain to you, certain historical episodes are less consistent with some stories than others, so some experiences will be compelling. Which brings me to the next reason, the second reason why I think that we don't learn from history. And that is simply because we don't live long enough. The thing is, the kind of knowledge that we get from history is of at least 2 categories. Number one, we can read about it. We can get it from what people write down in their or tell us about, or we get it from being there. And to put it in a trite way, there is no substitute for being there. So I may tell my kids about how it is that most of America came to believe that inflation and unemployment were not alternatives, having lived through the Carter administration society running up with the big deficit in the Vietnam War, and hearing the other side from Ronald Reagan's advisors and Margaret Thatcher and so on, and that's the world that I lived through. But when I tell my kids about this, it has no common urgency for them. They don't. For them, it is so far removed. For them, it is so far removed from their own experience that it is very hard for them to relate to it. Not until now, we're at that time. We are dependent, therefore, in else's memory. And the third reason is that we have tended in research more so and more so to denigrate, downplay the importance of history. It used to be elementary and education that we thought that particularly here in America, we should be so conscious of our very important unique history. All histories are unique, but this is uniquely unique, yes. I can just say that when I graduated with my PhD at the University of Chicago, they were in the process of phasing out the requirement of one course in economic history. And after I left, they scrapped it completely, which means that it is now possible to get a PhD in economics and in many other subjects that require basic knowledge of history to be really effective without ever having studied history. In fact, economics is on the path. My colleagues are typically very competent, and this is fatal. You can again be frivolous about it, but it is incredibly important. I try and remedy this in my classes. I don't teach economic history. I teach economic regulation. I teach economic principles. But I force history upon them. They don't know it. They love it, actually. Because if you teach history in a vital way, it's compelling, it's engaging. Because it involves personalities, it involves ideas, the clash of ideas. By the way, I would like to recommend a great book for libertarians by my colleague Larry White, called The Clash of Ideas. Just come out, Cambridge University Press, in paperback. It's about 25 bucks. Fantastic book about the clash of ideas in the last 100 years. So without history, really, you are at sea. You are really at a loss to understand. I mean, there's no way that you can understand the subprime crisis. There's no way you can understand any aspect of macroeconomic policy without understanding the history of economic regulation, without understanding the history of economic thought. Ideas matter. And the ideas, John Maynard Keynes, the individual who is perhaps most antithetical to libertarian macroeconomics, said that no economic policy is implemented without a tremendous reliance upon economic ideas, without the reliance without relying upon some long-dead academic scribbler. It's ironic that he should say that, since his influence is so powerful for bad. But for good or bad, these ideas are incredibly powerful. Stop someone in the street and ask them about economics, and they will give you a theory that they don't even realize has been shaped by some other economic theorist somewhere down the road. So for those three reasons, because history doesn't give us one answer, because we have to rely upon the memory of past generations, and because of our denigration of history, we find ourselves repeating historical mistakes of history. We find each generation basically having to make the same mistakes in order to learn from it. One just has to hope that every time they make a mistake, they repeat the same mistake, it doesn't get worse and worse. And that's my worst fear. So what particular mistakes of history am I referring to? Well, as I said, I'm an American by choice. I grew up in South Africa. I always wanted to do economics for a reason that I either never knew or have forgotten. But when I got to college, university, it's called it there, and studied economics, a 3-year degree and then an extra year of honors, I was captivated by the subject, and in particular I was very much mesmerized by the economics of that individual, John Maynard Keynes. For those of you who don't know, I pretty much imagine that just about everybody in this room knows who John Maynard Keynes was. So Keynes was a incredibly charismatic, persuasive, prominent, powerful individual who was the head of the most influential school of economics in the world at Cambridge. And he wrote a book called The General Theory of Money, Interest and Employment, sometimes mostly just referred to as the General Theory, which basically invented macroeconomics. Published in 1935, in 1936, and in 1935 he wrote a memo, a note to George Bernard Shaw, the famous Scottish socialist playwright. He said, "I am putting the finishing touches on a book that will revolutionize the way that people think about economics." Keynes was a believer in the powers of benevolent government, in the powers of a benevolent elite. He was a thoroughgoing elitist. He had a deep-seated contempt for most people who he thought were too stupid and too ill-informed to make decisions for themselves and need to be led by the likes of him. But the thing is, he was probably well-meaning and he was probably sincere, and he certainly was incredibly eloquent and persuasive and influential. And he was particularly appealing to young people like I was, sort of late adolescents who wanted to change the world. He had a message that said that there's a lot of the economy that goes on the basis of emotions and psychology. That basically the stock market was like a casino, and that it can easily get out of hand. That the market economy, if not guided by some benevolent, better-knowing expert, regulator, if you like, we would say today, would be inclined to inflict unnecessary pain upon unprotected individuals. And when you're young, you want to be able to make a better world. And the aspect when somebody tells you that the economy is driven a lot by psychology, they tell you something that in your maturing conceptual apparatus you may be beginning to realize yourself. And so I, like many, embraced Keynesianism. I tell you this so that you can understand that, in a way, we don't get too far when we demonize those who disagree with us. We get much further when we attempt very carefully to understand what it is that they're saying and where they're coming from. And then maybe we can understand how to sort of move them away from their deep-seated convictions. It took a long time to move me. But when I left South Africa and went to the University of Chicago in September of 1972, as I said, one of my first classes was from Milton Friedman. And it was like, I actually had economics in Milton Friedman because I had done an honors thesis on his monetary policy. And I respected him, or I found him annoyingly impressive. But I wasn't convinced. I was Keynesian, and I spent about 6 months, my first 6 months in Chicago, trying to persuade the rest of them trying to tell them why they were wrong. But by the time to the case, was fraud very dangerous. Friedman was price theory, not monetary. Many people don't know that he's an incredible price theorist. First and foremost, a price theory. Later on, he became a monetary theorist. In fact, I think his monetary theory is inferior to the Austrian variety, as I'll try and explain to you. In any case, I had been exposed to Austrian economics in South Africa because my teacher in South Africa was a professor whose name was Ludwig Lachmann, who actually was not an Austrian, he was a German. He had grown up in Berlin, and he had to leave Berlin for obvious reasons. He was a Jew and he was a free marketer, and he came to London where he met Friedrich Hayek. He worked with Friedrich Hayek, who was a colleague and a younger colleague, a student, and then he, after the war, moved to South Africa. He lost touch with Hayek, and he stayed in South Africa from 1950 until the rest of his life. The last few years of his life he spent a semester each year at New York University, where we reunited, he and I, after I had moved to Dallas. So Lachmann had taught me all about Austrian economics, about Austrian capital theory, but when I went to Chicago, I sort of put that part of my brain on hold, because the Austrians mostly had never heard of, excuse me, the Chicagoans had never heard of the Austrians, and I needed to pass my exam. But then when I finally came to Dallas in 1979, I reconnected with my Austrian roots. But by that stage, I was already convinced that the Keynesian message was wrong. Part of it was going through the Chicago experience. But the other part, as I said to you quite simply, was the fact that when Milton Friedman gave his presidential address in 1968 or 1969, which was entitled The Role of Monetary Policy, when he said that monetary policy should try and do that which is possible and should avoid assiduously trying to do that which is impossible. And the two things that he said that it should try and avoid doing is, number one, determining interest rates, and number two, modifying the business cycle. Trying to change the level of unemployment, trying to reduce the level of unemployment by keeping interest rates low. Because he said in the end, it will achieve neither. In the end, interest rates will rise because it will provoke inflation, and unemployment will rise along with inflation. So that rather than inflation and unemployment being alternatives, they are in effect things that occur together. That in fact, that inflation is something that will feed unemployment and not be an alternative to unemployment. This is such a fundamental, in the academic circles we call this the Phillips curve. It is such a fundamental idea that it sort of surprises me to find, again, the way in which old ideas are sort of recycled, that we repeat the mistakes of history. We learned that inflation and unemployment are not alternatives. How did we learn that? Because during the Carter administration and just beyond, we found a new American word to explain what was happening out there, namely stagflation. In other words, the combination of inflation and unemployment. And Milton Friedman had said, if you persist in a policy of trying to reduce unemployment below its natural market level, what you will end up in doing is stimulating both inflation and unemployment. That was in 1968, and in 1975 there it was. That's what persuaded people. That was an historical event that made people sit up and take note and say, yeah, there are many interpretations of this historical event. But you know what? Here's a guy who said it, and another guy, Friedrich Hayek, who said it in the 1930s. And the Nobel Prize Committee, Economics Prize Committee, obviously was also moved insofar as they decided it was congruent enough, the correspondence between events and the theory was close enough that they decided to give the Nobel Prize to Friedrich Hayek in 1974 and Milton Friedman in 1976. In that instance, we learned for that moment at least a little bit from history, didn't we? And that I learned from it, and the people around me, and when I left, I thought to myself, it's amazing. We now understand that the basic tenets of monetarism are true. That inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, and that if you misuse the monetary instrument, you are going to do much more harm than good. I learned also that there were aspects that had already been clearly explained by the Austrians. Actually, perhaps not so clearly, because that's some of the work that I'm doing. And that is that the Austrians paid particular attention to the production structure and argued that when the government purports to stimulate economic activity and thereby create jobs, what it succeeds in doing is stimulating certain kinds of sectoral economic activity and taking jobs away from somewhere else, thereby distorting the productive structure, the employment of both capital and labor. And in doing so, creates a situation, a distortion, that is necessarily unsustainable and will come to an end, or go the business cycle. So that the business cycle, whether or not it contains inflation, which is the monetarist, which is what the monetarist suggested, whether or not contains inflation, the distortionary policy itself will bring about this business cycle. So I was convinced that we had learned that lesson. I could not imagine that people would once again invoke Keynesian economics with a straight face. That is more testimony to my naivety and lack of understanding history itself, yes, than it is to the truth of the matter. So I don't know when it was that I finally woke up, because we had this long period this sort of great, the long moderation, so to speak, Ronald Reagan, whatever the imperfections of his economics, there were some, and of course his foreign policy, he at least was an improvement on what went before. And certainly Margaret Thatcher was a big improvement in the British case. We got a simplification of the tax code, although we got an increase in, of course, in payroll taxes. And we got seemingly a commitment, at least in rhetoric, to certain kinds of ideas. In fact, I think some of the economic achievements, if you could call it that, already as far away from the Reagan administration as the Clinton administration, were things that had been with the result of events that had been set in motion already back then, which is one of the problems of economic policy, is that the effects of economic policy are distributed in a variable way over a long period of time. We look at today's news as though that was caused by yesterday's actions. But today's news, in many respects, was caused by actions that might have been taken 5 or 8 years ago, in many respects. So there was a lot of undoing, if you like, while we went back to business as usual in the incomplete, dramatically incomplete Reagan Revolution. We went back to starting with his successor, read my lips, George Bush the Elder, you remember that? And the whole thing then becomes unstuck with the dot-com boom, I guess. My interpretation, or the Austrian interpretation of that event, is really quite simple. We have this continual push and pull between the march of technology, the information age, the digital revolution, and the encroachment of government largesse, the encroachment of government and what happens to our freedom and what happens to our well-being really depends upon which of those manages to outrun the other, so to speak. And a lot of improvement to our lives has definitely come about as a result of this definitely real technological improvement by way of the information age, by way of the digital revolution. It is a decades-long and momentous change in the technology of doing business, in the technology of everyday life. It is, in a sense, a kind of event similar to the Industrial Revolution. And in itself, it brings its own cycles, it brings its own fluctuations. Because it brings, in a sense, that not everything that Keynes said was wrong. Keynes was right about the fact that there is, in normal business life, a lot of psychology. There's a lot that depicts. And in a time like that, with a new technology, there are many ideas floating around, and many different people harbor different expectations about the same future. And it is the role of the market process to sort out between these things. But different necessarily means that some people, in fact, it means that if 10 people have different expectations about the same event, so it means that most likely 10 of them are going to be, one of them is going to be partially right. Maybe some of them more than partially right. You don't need to maximize profits, you just need to make positive profits, right? So the point is not wrong. What does it mean to be wrong? It means you make capital losses. It means that the resources that you committed in one direction have to be recommitted, undone, restructured, and put into something else. And it is natural when there is a new technology to get a sort of a clustering of errors in this way. So we get a bunch of startups, we get a bunch of what in retrospect appear to be speculative guesses, entrepreneurial gambles for certain kinds of events. And it is in the natural course of the process, of the market process, that most of these will fail. And that those that don't fail, in the same way that when the automobile first came on the scene, there was something like 700 automobile companies. And once everything shakes out, you have these ups and downs, and once everything shakes out, you sort out those good ideas from the bad ideas. But what does this imply? It implies that as the boom gets going and really starts heating up, interest rates tend to rise because you have increasing competition, increasing demand from these optimistic, adventurous, excited entrepreneurs for a limited amount of capital. And when interest rates rise, that is the natural market break to the economy telling us that this ought to slow down. If at that point the central bank in its infinite wisdom decides they don't want to be the party pooper and therefore they ought to keep interest rates low, what they are doing is causing that boom to overshoot and proliferate the number of bad ideas. Which is what they did, right? 6 successive times reducing interest rates in order to prevent the boom from coming to an end. Of course, the boom does come to an end, but when it comes to an end, the bust is much bigger. Hayek in the 1930s said, when the interest rate rises, that is the natural break for the economy. But it was a lesson that we were doomed and maybe are doomed into eternity to repeat. But the bust of the dot-com cycle, cycles, you understand, are very subjectively constructed phenomena. They're not like the amplitude of a radio wave or something. Economic cycles are things that the beholder of the data fashions out of the data. So they see the dot-com cycle, they see the rise, they see the fall, they say, here's where it comes to an end. But another scenario is it doesn't come to an end. There's all that liquidity out there that has been pumped into the system to prevent the boom from busting, and that liquidity, together with a series of distorting economic policies that most recently accelerate dramatically in the form of guaranteeing to every American, whether they can afford it or not, the ability to own their own home. That liquidity comes into financing these distortionary policies, to the granting of mortgage, to the acceptance of mortgage applications on the basis of no evidence whatsoever, on the basis of no standards whatsoever. There is pretty clear that it was a basically a mandated obliteration of normal kinds of mortgage acceptance standards. So what we do is, we revive the dot-com boom with a housing bubble, which ultimately, of course, means, again, a distortion. What does it mean? It means basically that we have created the housing sector becomes dramatically overbought, to put it in simple terms. Dramatically overbought. We have a distortion of the entire capital structure towards the production of housing that people cannot afford. The resources that are used in the production of housing could have been used somewhere else, should have been used somewhere else. So the cure for the subprime crisis, the bust of the housing bubble, is what? It's to structure the housing market, which will make housing prices have to come down, have to be allocated elsewhere. But the public, think about it, is basically dedicated to the opposite, namely to the revival of the housing market. In other words, what? To the re-inflation of the bubble, which brings us to basically where we are. When the crisis hits, we then get, this is, I guess, when I woke up. I began to feel very uneasy during the dot-com era. But when we get the end of 2007, early 2008 crash, and we start, getting these agglomeration of a small number of people sitting in an office who have an inordinate amount of power, the decision that if this institution goes bankrupt, it will be a risk that the rest of the economy cannot afford to take, and therefore we are going to obligate all of the taxpayers of America to support this institution. Then I began to wonder, what the heck is going on here? And of course, there was always, in case I had any doubts, there's always Paul Krugman too. But he has a Nobel Prize and I'm teaching at UTD, so why should you believe me? The complexity, the word comes up. Then they're telling us that Keynesian, we need to reinvigorate the economy with good old Keynesian medicine. So that of my paper for the Foundation for Economic Education publication with Freeman, called Recycling Discredited Ideas. And it basically brings us to the current situation. And also, in more detail in the article that I wrote with a younger colleague, Adrian Ravier, who's from Argentina, but he teaches in Maracay University, Francisco Maracay University in Guatemala. And we looked at some of the evidence and find, of course, the consistency of interpreting the current historical episode with a basic Austrian story, with the distortion of the capital structure. We look at this various and enormous stimulatory, monetary and fiscal stimulatory effects, and we find no evidence that it had any. I don't think one single job, not one single job, has been created by the stimulation. So, I'll leave it at that. That's really what I wish I could come to you with a more optimistic message. One of the, I guess, sort of one of the apprehensions I had about appearing in front of a political gathering is precisely sort of my disillusionment with politicians in general, and my conviction that politicians face a kind of a hopeless situation. You know, Hayek wrote an article about the socialist economy, the socialist society, in which it was entitled "Why the Worst Get on Top." In a sense, a political life is a situation in which you pay much more attention to form rather than substance, and which you invite people who are very self-serving, which is perhaps one of the reasons why we no longer have presidents who have any kind of, you know, really intellectual stature. I mean, where people like, when you think about people like Thomas Jefferson or John Adams, where are they today? Well, where they may be around, but they don't enter politics. And just because of the big money bags that John spoke about. And so I had some apprehension in coming to talk in front of a political audience. But then I thought about it. Libertarians, classical liberals. Basically what this is about, they have a conviction, right, in the necessity of small government and the necessity of frugal government. The question is not that they would get elected and be corrupted. The question is, if enough people could elect them, it means that we would have done our job of education. And that even if they were tempted, and even if they were corrupted, they wouldn't get away with it.
Thanks, that was great. I've not had the privilege of hearing you speak before. We had several of our guys who have had some experience with it said, oh, he's going to be great. Boy, they were right. That was fantastic, and you're right that history can be compelling if you present it in the right way and make it interesting. Thank you. Left, I'll let you ask some questions of Dr. Lewin. A couple things real quick first. If you do need to slip out, please help us out in a couple of different ways. We've got some comment cards over here on the table. Let us know what you thought of this event, ideas you have for other things we can do like this.
And in front of you on the table as well, too. And also, too, because this was a successful event, we want to know how you wrote the event, so if you want to let us know, we'd appreciate that as well.
In the ambition box.
Thank you. And yes, we'd like to grow this group bigger and get more people exposed to these ideas. We have big ambitions and a commensurately sized donation box over there, labeled ambition. If you help us try to fulfill these big ambitions, we would surely appreciate that. Thank you.
As far as questions, we're going to go ahead and just let you yell them out. We're not going to carry the mic.
One of my heroes is Karl Popper. He taught at the London School of Economics. He was an Austrian as well, but he was a philosopher rather than an economist. And what he said was, democracy is great not for what it does, but for what it prevents. Does the Austrian School of Economics fit well with Popper's view from a philosophical standpoint? And do you believe that there's a necessity to go beyond mere metrics in economics and graft in philosophical value to the debate?
Okay, that's a huge question. Karl Popper was an Austrian, and he was a personal friend of Friedrich Hayek, a very close personal friend. He was very much influenced by Hayek. Hayek was older than he was. Hayek got him his job at the London School of Economics, and Hayek was very much influenced by him, which means that Popper's ideas about the open society, and more particularly his ideas about the philosophy of science, about how you come by knowledge, very much influenced Hayek in his story about the theory of complex phenomena, about how we know things. I just got back from London recently, in which I talked at a think tank there, a libertarian, classical liberal think tank, on what do we know for certain about uncertainty. And one of the things I said that was because there are some things we don't know very well, we should realize that we can not perfectly keep separate we cannot perfectly maintain a separation between facts and values. In other words, what you require to be proven in order to endorse an economic intervention, let's say, an economic policy intervention by government, will depend very much on your values and what you can know. So, yeah, when you think about economic policy, you think about what it is possible to know, then you have to think about what you need to know in order to say that we ought to do this or that or the other. So you can't avoid talking about values. But as an academic, you have to try and at least come clean on those things. You have to say, because I believe in freedom, this is where I believe the burden of proof is going to be. Yeah.
Professor Lewin, great talk. Narrower question. When we talk about overstimulating the housing bubble, I mean, I guess we can think of a lot of things did between the, Community Reinvestment Act that forced banks to give loans to people who couldn't afford them, or maybe even the tax code, mortgage interest deductions and that. Can we pin anything specifically on the Fed other than the generalized loose money policy as far as shuttling this easy money into the housing boom as opposed to other sectors?
Okay, that's a tough question, and that is one of the issues that prevents a less ambiguous interpretation of what happened. So there are people who can argue consistently that the housing bubble has nothing to do with monetary policy. But basically, to make a short answer, you've got the Community Reinvestment Act, and then you've got a whole series of initiatives, if you like, off the books, so to speak, of legislative initiatives, and some of them that go through Congress, that work through basically the terrible triplets, Fannie Mac and Freddie Mac. And these quasi-governments, one of the things I teach also is money and financial markets, and I've been teaching for about, I don't know, 20 years at least. So at least for the last 10 years I've been saying that there is something that is very troubling about these institutions. And if you look at their books, you will see that basically they are not supposedly government agencies and the government has no obligation to them, but there's something that very worries me a lot, because the interest rates that they are able to pay are much lower than market interest rates, only because they have this implicit government guarantee. So these guys are the guys who basically completely revolutionized the mortgage market. If you're not playing with Fannie Mae, you're not playing, is how they do it. They start making the dictating conditions. And then we have the other terrible twins, Barney Frank and Chris Dodd, who are politicians, but in another life might be criminals.
Yeah.
Is there really a difference?
In today's world. So, what did he say? I'm prepared to throw the dice on Fannie Mae one more time. So the question becomes, these excesses, these regulatory excesses, could they have gone that far without the easy money that the Fed provided? And it depends how you answer that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
I want to reiterate wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed. Thank you so much. And in your world of economists, it appears that, it really is a philosophical question, really, in terms of what's important to humanity. It sounds to me like the reason and logic doesn't necessarily prevail inside the world of academic economists. Is that, I mean, because you presented to us a very logical, very reasonable argument for our current state of affairs.
Yeah, I was asked a similar question before I got up here, and it is an issue. It will come as no surprise to you that I am not typical of my profession.
Amen.
I don't know exactly how to characterize it. Many years ago I began to want, it's this whole question of this sort of infatuation with numbers. This sort of the denigration of quality and the elevation of quantity. That if you can't measure it, you don't really know about it. And if you can't measure it anyway. And if you measure it, then you know it. It's like the drunk man looking for his keys under the lamppost, because that's where the light is, even though he dropped it over there. There are simply some, what Hayek tells us is that the social world is so complex, like many parts of the natural world, but certainly the social world is so complex that basically quantitative predictions are not possible. You can get what we call pattern predictions. If you impose a minimum wage above the market wage, you will cause unemployment. If you attempt to reduce the rate of unemployment below its natural market rate, you will succeed in stimulating inflation. But I am one of those economists who will tell you that, will assert that with as much confidence as I can muster. But if you ask me to make a point prediction, how much unemployment exactly? How much inflation exactly? I'll tell you I don't predict that, because it's not possible to predict that. And that's not the kind of thing that sells in academics or gets you tenure. What gets you tenure is if you come in with a very quantitative model and you put it on the table and you say, look how smart I am. And you can use this model to make these very point predictions, and in the best of all possible worlds, only you and one other person will be able to understand it. Because that way you will have insulated yourself completely from criticism. So the economics profession basically becomes a narrower and narrower group of technicians to whom few end up listening. There's a bifurcation. On the one hand, you get the economists who are these glorified technicians, and on the other hand, you get people like me who are political economists who use the full arsenal of understanding and interpretation. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that mathematics is not helpful. I don't think that statistics is not helpful. But you have to use it in a good dose of common sense and a good dose of intuitive interpretation. Now, as to your question about values, I think Milton Friedman is right when he said that most disagreements boil down not to the fundamental values themselves, but to the means to their achievement. Most of them. And so the fact is, if we can just get past that, we might be able to become more persuasive. Let me take one on this side. Yeah.
Ron Paul made the statement that when the world loses confidence in the dollar, that's when we will be in trouble. Since we're the ones that print the money and we have to give back to the world currency. We have what's going on in Greece, everyone sees what's going to go on with the pigs, Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. And we also see countries diversifying out of the dollar. How long do you estimate until the world loses confidence in the dollar?
Okay, that's one of those questions that I can answer without fear of contradiction. I have no idea. I endorse what he said. I do believe that the losing faith in the dollar is a fundamental turning point. I can say one thing, if you like, about what's going on in Greece and Italy and Spain, is that they sort of oscillate between these clouds, so to speak. Because Greece is very small and Spain is a little bigger and Italy is even a bit bigger. Eventually we're going to get to France. The question was for a long time, is Greece going to exit the euro? Is it going to get? That's really not the point. It seems like more and more people are coming to the realization that it's to have a common currency doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a common monetary policy. Doesn't mean you have to be part of a common political entity. All Greece really needs to do, if they wanted to sort of get to a new situation, is to decide to say, we are now going to allow our citizens to choose whatever currency they want. And then they will choose. Okay, you're hitting all these these things that I don't have time to deal with. Thank you. Yeah, we now face. Well, let me start by saying this. I said that we make the same mistakes over and over again. We repeat the mistakes of history. There is, at least in this situation, one aspect that has never occurred before. We are in uncharted territory insofar when we look at the reserves that are now sitting on the bank balance sheets. Never before have we had a situation in which the Fed, in which any central bank has pumped up the money base, right? In other words, the foundation upon which fiat money, this checking accounts and paper money and so on, is created through the banks. Never before have we had such a situation where banks have had this level of reserves. I mean, it's very hard to overstate the extent of the newness of this. Normally there is a multiple, right? The banks hold a certain level of reserves, some of which they're required to hold, there's some in excess, and they lend a certain multiple of that in deposits, which is the basis of our money. In a competitive situation, they would be disciplined to keep that ratio more or less constant because of the return flow into the system. But as long as the Fed, those reserves, those cash reserves that are available, is what the Fed puts in through open market operations or through funding the budget deficit by the government. Well, that is normally a multiple. Deposits to reserves is a multiple. Now, reserves are greater than deposits. The multiplier is negative. From about 2007 to the current period, the level of reserves on the bank balance sheets increased 1,100%. Which means when people start taking loans from banks and banks start lending out, it's going to start pushing up the supply of money. Exploding the supply of money. You may have heard reference to exit strategy. Don't worry about that, says Uncle Ben Bernanke, because he has a way of getting out of it. Now, I've exaggerated a little bit, because some of that is the result of the Fed having bought these toxic bonds that are going to expire, they're going to mature, and some of those reserves will automatically be run down. And there may be some other ways that they can be so-called sterilized. But if and when they're not, the answer to your question is all this money is going to spill over into the economy and it's going to cause inflation. And lots of it, unless they take it away. Did that answer
so you're saying buy gold?
I don't. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Have you heard of Professor Steve Keen of Australia?
Yes.
Do you think his idea of a debt jubilee will ever happen, or at least maybe a couple countries in Europe, maybe?
De facto et jure, yes. Eventually, I mean, somebody's going to have to take a bath in all this debt, and some already have. So it'll either be official or it'll just happen.
Do you think his other ideas seem pretty good?
Say again?
Are the rest of his ideas pretty good, or?
I think I met him once, and we've had a conversation, and we're on the same page, but I can't claim any close familiarity with him. Yeah.
Real simple, but not so simple question. What is the smartest way to help our economy reset from all these crazy bubbles we've had?
Milton Friedman was once asked, if they made you king, if they made you dictator, at which point he said, no, I don't want to be the dictator. If I can't persuade people to believe in what I believe in, then I don't want them to do it. Well, fiscal discipline. You know, I know people talk about the gold standard and they talk about other things, but basically we have to go back. I mean, let's think about what are the most severe problems. Most severe problems we face a deficit to income ratio of about 108%, which in and of itself is not so great. In Japan it's 230%. But that figure is a totally bogus figure because it excludes all of the unfunded mandates. And the most dangerous of which is the Medicare Medicaid. And if you put that in, it's more like 300%. So there's no way we can pay for it. And if we're going to do anything, we're going to have to tackle. The answer to your question is make a list of the most pressing problems and go down the list and do what you have to do. You're going to have to repeal those laws that establish them. You're going to have to remove the obligations. You're going to have to remove, you know, if you could do it. Yes.
So spend less, basically.
Say again?
So spend less, basically.
Oh, absolutely. Fiscal response, I mean, that goes without saying. But what are you going to cut first, I suppose? Yeah.
Obviously, your colleagues don't know what you're talking about, if your PhD colleagues, but how are your students tracking it? Are they so brainwashed in the left and right paradigm that they can't track with you?
I love that question. I once went on to interview in a job in California. This was when California was bad, but not as bad as it is now. I used to joke with my students. I would say, you know, we want you to Canada because they deserve each other. But now, given what's happened in Canada, I would say that would be a gross insult to Canada. I'm in Texas, and most of my students love what I say. They love it, yeah.
I have a follow-up to this. Well, the same was when you teach a class, like obviously you come off different than most economists. So when you teach a class, you have to tell the students you're going to learn information that's different than what these other kids learn, or
yes. When I was in California, I gave a model lesson. Right? They were going to hire me to head up a very small business school. So they said, we need you to teach a lesson. So I prepared a lesson on inflation and unemployment. And I was teaching these, I think they were senior undergraduates in a liberal arts college, very smart kids. But they were in California and they were extremely liberal in the American sense of the word. And it kind of blew their minds. But they were interested. Some of them came up with the afternoon and started saying words like Karl Marx and other things. As we were walking away from the classroom, the teachers who normally taught that class, they were sort of two teachers team teaching it. They kind of looked at me and they said, is that going to be fairly typical of the sort of thing that you're going to be teaching here? And I said, what are you worried about? I said, are you worried that I'm going to brain them? I said, don't worry. He said, I strive for balance. I balance in my classroom all the garbage that they get outside. I warn my students. Yeah.
So let's assume that Austrian economics is a superior way to think about economics. Can we see businesses building success on using an Austrian model to avoid pitfalls that the government's putting in the way, or do we see nations committed to that? I mean, it seems like in a marketplace of states or businesses, you would see states with a superior viewpoint succeed where others fall. Do we see that?
Austrian economics is not a paradigm of basically sound business principles. I mean, it includes those. I have some colleagues in the insurance industry. Aspect of that is not here is that I once had a real job. I worked for 5 years for a company called CompUSA. I was a founding shareholder of that company. A friend of mine had started it. So I worked there and I got a real education about what it is like to be in a business. I hate it every day. But that's just because I wasn't cut out for the business world. I enjoy this much too much. Was there anything in my Austrian economics education that helped me implement sound business principles? Well, yes and no. I mean, basically what does it tell you? It tells you about fiscal discipline. It tells you you have to be responsible for your actions. It tells you basically that the pursuit of profit is not immoral. That in fact in pursuing profit you're not doing anything that will harm anybody, that you don't, in fact quite the opposite, that very often if you try and do what is against the interests of the business and the shareholders, you end up harming the rest of society in ways that you cannot imagine. It teaches you that basically the social fabric and the social order is much too complicated for anybody to understand, is much bigger than anybody in a single individual can affect. But it's not a doctrine of detailed business principles. I teach in a business school, and they teach a subject called entrepreneurship, and I write on entrepreneurship. And I'm here to tell you, for better or for worse, there's no silver bullet about how to make money. Buy low, sell high.
time and sharing with us tonight. We've got a certificate of our appreciation for you here, and this coin of hard specie, pure silver, has intrinsic value and does not require the full faith and increasingly dubious credit of the United States government. Thanks again for coming, everybody. It was a lot of fun. Again, please tell us who you are and let us